Hello, I'm Shahin and Nژاد from the Iranian Renaissance movement, Children of Ferdowsi, and I'm glad to have one of our intellectual in the movement, Dr. Jaisun Jorjani, the professor in New Jersey Institute of Technology. And the subject of our discussion today is the Iranian influence on Greek culture, philosophy, and also political school of thought. Just I wanted to give a very, very short introduction why we are having these types of programs is usually when we talk about the Iranian and Greek worlds, most of the articles, most of the talks, most of the presentations, the big majority of them are all about the wars between Iran or Persia with the Greek worlds and confrontations, conflicts, all the tension and frictions between these two entities are the focal points of the discussions or articles. And if in rare cases, researchers and scholars have paid attention to the intellectual influence on one of these on the other one, unfortunately, we see a kind of biased approach in the Westerner researchers and professors toward the Iranian world and the benefit of Greek world. Just this time we wanted to have a more impartial and realistic interpretation of what we observe between these two entities, and also try to see what kind of transfer of culture and thoughts have occurred between these two. And perhaps the expert who can talk about that, Dr. Jorjani, is going to take us through some of these topics, if not necessarily in one program, but in several programs. Before going through the first issue that I'm going to raise, just I wanted to ask Dr. Jorjani that when we talk about Greek world, usually, at least in Iranian society, people refer to Athens. So when they talk about democracy, perhaps it's about Athens. When we talk about a civic society, it's about Athens. We know that there have been a lot of contradictions and big differences between different parts of the Greek world, from Athens to Sparta and from Sparta to Ionia and other places. So for clarification, Dr. Jorjani, in this conversation, when we talk about Greek, are we talking about the general Greek world, or we are specifically talking about Athens?
Well, we have to remember that the Greeks and the Persians share a common Indo-European origin. And during the course of the Persian Wars, it was very clear to the Persian ruling class, at any rate, that the culture of Sparta was somewhat more similar to the Persian culture than that of Athens. The other thing that we ought to keep in mind is that some of the wealthiest Greek city-states were on the western coast of Anatolia. And these were the first parts of Greece to be under Persian dominion. It's also from this part of the Greek world that science or philosophy arose, for the most part. So focusing on Athens and the conflict between the Persians and the Greeks from the beginning distorts the nature of the discussion.
Thanks for that clarification. It's good for many of our folks to know that when we talk about Anatolia, today the Anatolia has a kind of Turkish identity, or at least the majority of that. But way before getting the Turks into Anatolia, in 15th century, on the west side of Anatolia, the Greek culture was predominant, and many of those cities were populated by originally Greek people. And in further east of the Anatolia, we had Iranian original people, Kurds, and also Armenian. So in the past 6 centuries almost, the climate has changed, and it shouldn't make us confused when we talk about Greeks. As Dr. Jorjani pointed out, it's not about the current Greece only, it's about a wider area which covers the west of Anatolia as well. When it comes, Dr. Jorjani, the subject of Iranian influence on Greek thoughts or Greek philosophy, one essential element which has been included in some of the recent works have been the influence of Zarathustra or Zartosht on Greek philosophers. We know the essential element of Zarathustra teachings was Ahura Mazda. Maybe a breakthrough in defining the universe creation, which came out to be Ahura Mazda in Zartosht philosophy, has penetrated the Greek philosophy in some extent and has influenced it significantly. Could you please take us through what has been this impact and where we can observe this phenomenon?
Sure. So the first thing that we need to do if we're going to address that subject is have a little bit of a sense of dates here, time periods. Because when people think of Greece, people who've been educated throughout the Western world, they think of classical Greece. But Zarathustra, there have been wide-ranging dates for Zarathustra. It's a very controversial subject. However, what we know is that for certain, he was at least 1200 BC. And this puts us even before the works attributed to Homer. So the oldest Greek literature that we have is the Iliad, and that's been dated to around 700, 800 BC. And if you look at archaic Greek culture, pre-classical Greek culture, there appears to be no essential change in the mentality of the Greeks between, let's say, 700 BC and the time that the Persians began to colonize Greece. If you look at epic Greek literature, like the Iliad and perhaps the Odyssey, and if you look at the closest they ever came to any attempt at understanding the genesis of the universe in the Theogony of Hesiod, you see a culture which has no sense of human free will and self-determination. These are people who really believe their lives are governed by fate. And what's more peculiar is that in a text like the Iliad, which of course was not a text, it was an oral tradition, it was recited, only later written down. In the Iliad, anytime someone comes upon an idea, it doesn't appear that this is a thought generated by their own mind. A god appears to them, almost as if they're hallucinating, okay? And this god puts an idea in their mind. Or if they suddenly find the courage for an extraordinary act of bravery and warfare, it's because suddenly Ares has possessed them from within, as if they've come under the demonic possession of Ares. So you have these people who are passive to external forces that move them almost as if they're under demonic possession. They have no sense of free will. The other important thing is that because they believed in a pantheon of gods who often were at war with one another, and the only way that they could wrap their minds around how nature functioned was to think of natural forces as an expression of the will of the gods, they also saw themselves to be at the mercy of capricious forces behind earthquakes and typhoons, hurricanes, and so forth. So in that sense as well, they had no control over their lives. They were reduced to ritualistic appeasement of capricious and tyrannical gods, the worst of them being Zeus himself, who frankly is a chronic liar and serial rapist. Not exactly the model of cultivation of virtue that you would want at the head of your pantheon. The most important observation to take away from this situation and the religious life of the Greeks is that it was reflected in rather barbaric conduct when it came, say, to warfare. The Greeks engaged in wars of rape and plunder. And the main consequence of them was the institution of slavery. Slavery based initially on taking prisoners of war. So this gives you a very different picture of Greece than the one that Westerners absorbed through their textbooks on the classical period. Now we have to remember that at the same time as all of this was going on in Greece, actually even before that, we have Zarathustra in ancient Iran as a philosopher who presages some of the core ideas that we see in the earliest Greek philosophers emanating from Ionia, the part of Greece that was under Persian colonization. But perhaps before we get into the pre-Socratic philosophers, especially the ones that were most directly under Iranian influence, like Heraclitus and Pythagoras, we could say something about Greek tragedy, which also arose immediately as the Persians were colonizing Greece, and probably marks the first significant break with this epic culture of the archaic period.
It's very interesting, Dr. Jorjani. If I want to get one sentence from a portion of your answer, am I right to say the Greek philosophy was heavily polluted by mythology before they get the influence of Iranian Zartostra on their side? So gradually they came out from the mythology part of that, and they got closer to the pure philosophy, which is all about the state of mind and wise and wisdom, and trying to have a discussion without getting interrupted by gods and mighty powers from outside, which was the perhaps the trend of mythological philosophy of Greece over centuries. Am I right?
Yes, but you're being too generous. Insofar as you're talking about a philosophy in Greece before the colonization of Greece by the Persians, there was no philosophy in Greece. Mm-hmm. This was a purely mythological, ritualistic culture. Mm-hmm. And so before we talk explicitly about the first philosophers, let me just say a few words about tragedy, and in particular, the first great figure of Greek tragedy, which is Prometheus. Mm-hmm. So Aeschylus, as far as we can tell, is the first Greek tragedian, and tragedy represents a whole new art form. Instead of one bard reciting epic, you have a stage play inside of an amphitheater where the audience can take the position of an objective spectator. This is very significant because you don't see this in any other tribal cultures before the Greeks. If there are dramatic enactments in tribal societies, the whole tribe participates in those. And they often involve ritualistic reenactments of things that the gods did or how the gods brought certain things into being in the world. When you take the position of an objective spectator on a stage play, you're gaining a certain psychological perspective on your life. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is we have individual characters highlighted in the context of tragedy, and the sense that their fates are unjust. After all, I mean, this is what makes a tragedy. Mm-hmm. If you can contemplate the fate of an individual as being unjust. This means that at least subconsciously, you're imagining an alternative future that this person could have had.
That's right.
That means you're coming out from under the view of all of nature and life being determined by fate. I don't think it's at all an accident that the first major figure of Greek tragedy is Prometheus. And Aeschylus, who wrote this trilogy about Prometheus, is also famous for having written a play called The Persians, which involves the return of Khashayar-Shah, or Xerxes, to Iran after his defeat at the hands of the Greeks.
So you don't see it as a coincidence?
Not at all. In fact, if we compare Prometheus Bound to the Persians, we see that Aeschylus is trying to draw a comparison between the titanic character of Xerxes and Prometheus the rebel against Zeus, which also changes, by the way, the interpretation of the Persians. But to focus on Prometheus. So Prometheus was in the Greek pantheon, but he was relatively insignificant until Aeschylus wrote this Star Wars-like trilogy about him at that time. And Prometheus has a number of attributes that connect him very closely to Ahura Mazda. First of all, he is the god of fire, both the light of knowledge and the fire of the forge. Did you want to interject something, or?
Just I wanted, for Iranian listeners, I wanted to clarify, perhaps many of them know already, that Prometheus is usually we refer to him as Promote. Thank you. Go ahead.
So Prometheus is the god of fire, and he is known for having stolen fire from the gods and gifting this to mortals, both as a light in the darkness of ignorance, the ignorance that the unjust god Zeus had imposed on humanity, and also as the fire of the forge, meaning the key to all technological development. Prometheus's name also means forethought, or prevision, provision, thinking ahead, progressive mind. Well, this is directly equivalent to Spentamenu, or Sepandmanesh, for the progressive mentality that's the chief attribute of Ahura Mazda.
Absolutely.
Then, of course, Prometheus is a Titan. He's a god, but he's among a class of gods referred to as the Titans, and the Titans are always at war with the Olympians. This is a direct analog to the conflict between the Ashuras and the Devas in the old Indo-Iranian pantheon. So Ashura Mazda, or Ahura Mazda, is the Titan of wisdom. Well, Prometheus is exactly that. He's the Titan of wisdom. And in fact, he's also the creator of humanity. In Greek mythology, Prometheus creates humanity, and Zeus steals humanity away and chains people with ignorance and servitude to the Olympians. Prometheus's gift of fire to humanity is intended to liberate them and bring them into what was supposed to be their destiny, namely to be a race of gods in their own right.
Thank you, Jorjani. This is very, very interesting subject. I hadn't seen it before, so this is the first hand that I'm hearing, fortunately. Could you please also mention the timing of these two phenomena, Ahura Mazda in the Iranian side and also Prometheus or Promote in the Greek world? I want to give a sense of timing of these two to our listeners.
So as I mentioned earlier, Zarathustra was 1200 BC or sometime before that. I actually tend to think it was significantly before that, but we won't get into those debates. So 1200 BC. Prometheus is relatively insignificant in the Greek pantheon. There's hardly a mention of him until Aeschylus writes his trilogy, and that's around 500 AD. BC, 500 BC. So we're talking about a distance of about 700 years at the very least.
That's right.
Between the Gospel of Ahura Mazda in the mouth of Zarathustra and Prometheus becoming the first great figure of Greek tragedy.
And it will be interesting in another occasion also, since tragedy was raised here, we go and look at the Iranian side and see how big tragedies, very impressive tragedies like Rostam and Sohrab, or Rostam and Isfandiar, should, if it has had also impact on the Greek side, since when it comes to the timing of these, we know that they are not limited to Shahnameh or Khodainameh, at least about Rostam and Sohrab. It might be related to some heritage of the Saka culture. And also when it comes to Rostam and Isfandiar, we know that Isfandiar has been mentioned in details in Avesta. So it's a matter of how old is that particular Yasht or Yashts which have been talking about Isfandiar, but that's another topic. And sorry to interrupt you on this, but that will be very interesting to touch in another topic. Could you also, Dr. Jorjani, take us through what was the story between Darius the Great and also Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher? Why we hear about this, and what was the story between these two?
Okay, so let me just preface that by saying that the two major influences on Plato, who has been regarded as the great founder of Western philosophy. Some have said the whole history of Western philosophy consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. The two greatest influences on Plato were Heraclitus and Pythagoras, and hopefully we'll be able to come to Pythagoras. But Heraclitus has a very explicit connection to Iran. He was at one point invited by Darius the Great to become the court philosopher of the Hachemanides dynasty. Mm-hmm. And it's true, you know, that Herodotus says the Persians were open to foreign ideas more than any other people. They were very open to learning the best from other cultures and incorporating it into their own. But I hardly think that that accounts for someone being invited to be the court philosopher of their empire, right, the Persian Empire. There must have been profound affinities between Heraclitus's way of thinking and the de facto Zoroastrianism of the Persian Empire. And in fact, if we look at the fragments of Heraclitus's writings on nature that are left, we see many parallels between his thinking and that of Zarathustra, and these have no precedent whatsoever in Greek thought. So one of them is the reverence for wisdom and good thought set apart from all else. In fact, at one point, Heraclitus suggests, he doesn't come straight out and say it because he might actually have been killed for doing so, later Socrates was, he suggests that Zeus is not the true God. And he refers to the true God as the wise one. And he says that the chief aim of human life is to cultivate good thought and to align one's thoughts, one's words, and one's deeds. That your deeds should uphold what you say, and that what you say and do should be based on careful contemplation, not a casual, unreflective acceptance of what others have said. And in this regard, he levels a scathing critique at the ritual priesthood and at the poetic bearers of tradition or custom among the Greeks, for example, Homer and Hesiod. He is as critical of Homer and Hesiod and of the ritualistic priesthood of the Greeks in his society as Zarathustra is of the priestly caste that he is engaged with in his time and whose power he's trying to displace, as we see in the Gathas.
Like Karpanha in Gatha.
Exactly. Sacrificial, ritualistic priests who are unreflectively passing on a poetic so-called wisdom. Another thing that we see that's very important is Heraclitus adopts fire, the undying fire, an everlasting fire, as the symbol of cosmic order. And in fact, this idea of cosmic order, which he refers to as logos, is identical to Asha or Arta in Persian thinking. and it's symbolized again by fire for Heraclitus. There's also an emphasis on dualistic or oppositional forces as being the wheelwork of evolutionary development in the cosmos. Then there are small details which are also significant, like, for example, he refers to throwing out corpses as quickly as one can. Well, this was anathema to the Greek practice of mortuary rites, but it's very similar to the Zoroastrians taking their dead bodies to the enclosures where they'd be picked clean by vultures.
That's right. Therefore, Dr. Jorjani, the reason that Darius the Great invited Heraclitus to come to Iran, it wasn't the case that he wanted the philosopher to come and fix them a school of thought or a school of philosophy, but most likely Darius the Great had heard about these teachings of him and see a lot of similarities between what he was trying to promote and what Darius the Great knew as a Zoroastrian, and therefore he found this Greek philosopher kind of promoter of Ahura Mazda and Zartosht teachings in the other side of the world, and because of this harmony he wanted to know him better and probably give him some capabilities to expand this campaign of promoting of Zarathustrian philosophy.
I'll tell you, I think it's an even more intimate connection than that, because I think the time when Darius extended this invitation was the moment when the Ionians, who had been propagandized to by the Athenians, revolted against the Persians. And the satrap, the Persian governor of Ephesus, was Heraclitus's personal friend, a man by the name of Hermodorus. Mm-hmm. And in his fragments, Heraclitus goes to the extent of saying, when his fellow countrymen revolted against the Persians, against his friend Hermodorus, who was ruling on behalf of the Persians, they ought to be hanged to the last man.
Wow.
Only the children should be left alive. This is what he says in his fragments. He was such an advocate of Persian rule and also such an opponent of democracy, which he saw as the rule of the rabble, of the uneducated mob, that he believed his fellow countrymen should be executed en masse. And at that point, instead of accepting Darius's invitation, he sequesters himself as a hermit in the temple of Artemis. Well, this is very important. Who is Artemis? I don't understand why I've never seen in the scholarly literature a discussion of the fact that this is clearly an Iranian name in origin. The Greeks tell us that Artemis was the goddess of the Amazons, and recent research has shown that the Amazons were a historical people. They were the female warriors among the Sarmatians, or Sarmad, or among the Scythians, the Sakas. And they, in fact, according to the Greeks, had built the original temple of Artemis, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Mm-hmm. It occurs to me that if you read Artemis, which has no clear sense in Greek, in the context of Persian linguistics, you get Arta Amesha, or immortal truth. So I think that Heraclitus knew full well who Artemis was when he sequestered himself in that temple and bestowed his writings to the priestesses of the goddess of the hunt. And by the way, the chief symbol of Artemis is, of course, the archer's bow, which is a symbol of truth in ancient Persian culture. Nietzsche quotes Zarathustra to the effect that to speak the truth and shoot well with arrows, that is Persian virtue. So we have that as well as a piece of evidence for the connection between Heraclitus and Iran.
It's getting very interesting. You put the different pieces of the puzzle together, and it seems the influence of Iran on the Greek world has been much more than what we have imagined so far, especially the last point that you mentioned regarding the Artemis word and the meaning of it, and perhaps, as a matter of fact, when it is referred to Sarmatian, which has been an Iranian tribe, or being that tribe, an Iranian ethical group, it seems that now we are seeing more than what had been mentioned in the text, in the articles before about the Iranian influence on that, on the Greek side. Therefore, according to what I heard and you mentioned about Heraclitus' beliefs about those who have revolted against the Persian supremacy in that part of the world, it seems that we are not talking about a Greek citizen. We are talking about a Greek person by ethnicity, but a citizen of the Iran Shah, or Persian Empire. It seems that has been the case, because what this philosopher has expressed shows that he doesn't know himself as a part of that entity. He recognizes himself as an Iranian citizen who tries to defend the Pasha and wisdom, and perhaps in that case it was being under umbrella of Persian Empire, and also trying to have sympathy with what Persians have presented to them to be a kind of progressive elements for their own time.
I actually agree with that entirely.
Dr. Jorjani, we get to Pythagoras and also Plato, two very famous faces, even among the Iranian community, Iranian society, Pythagoras and Aflatun. I don't think it's good if we continue the discussion going through those famous philosophers and mathematicians about Pythagoras, and trying to really compress the discussion into few minutes. I think it's way more important than trying to merge it into the existing discussion. So while I really appreciate what you have taught us in this discussion, and I'm pretty sure that the listeners are going to wait to see the next program on the same subject, I appreciate if you join me in another program pretty soon and take us through about what we have given to the Western world indirectly, probably through Greeks and in some extent Romans, by touching what Plato and Pythagoras have learned from the Iranian culture, Iranian thoughts, and educate us on that subject.
I'm very much looking forward to that, Dr. Nژاد.
Thank you very much for being with us, and hope see you in next program.
Thank you. See you again soon.
Thank you.